Hi guys, welcome to the Attitudes and Persuasion chapter. So we are going to be talking about why people have the attitudes that they have about certain things and how we or others can persuade them, or how you can be persuaded to change that attitude. And if you hear baby talk, it's because there's a baby in the room. I'm babysitting, so hopefully it won't be too disruptive. You can't talk or make any noise, okay? He's 18 months old. I don't think that's going to work. All right, so we're going to talk about the nature of attitudes, describing the sources of attitudes, the factors that make attitudes resistant to change. You are going to talk the whole time, aren't you? Come here. Let's everybody meet you. This is Rowan. You want to teach the class? Huh? You're doing a very good job reading my notes. Just going to press buttons until it turns off. Okay, so what we're talking about today is attitudes. What is an attitude? Basically, an attitude is a positive or negative evaluation of something, of some particular thing. And attitudes can develop from many sources. You have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So with classical conditioning, basically, you learn to like or dislike something because it's associated with something that you like or dislike already. No, I have a doctorate in psychology. I think I'm correct. And then you have operant conditioning, where you're learning through consequences. Hopefully this is all familiar to you already from Psych 101. An example, like we may develop a positive attitude towards a certain political party because your parents rewarded you for also liking the same things, and they praised anything that you said that was in line with it. And then we might dislike certain objects or events or things because it becomes associated with punishment. And then we have observational learning. So, for instance, he's learning about teaching, and if you delete all of my notes, I'm going to have a harder time teaching this.
No.
Yes. Well, I can still teach it without my notes, but it'll be more difficult. Yes, be more difficult. So with observational learning, you come to develop this attitude because we observe others being rewarded or punished, expressing likes or dislikes for the same things. So like you might have a negative attitude towards dogs if someone you care about shows strong signs of fear or distress every time a dog comes around. Whereas Rowan is being raised on a farm, and so he's around all sorts of animals like cows. You want your cow? So you're just learning through observation. And then we have biological factors, and it's been suggested that there is an unlearned genetic component to attitudes, such as those involving political or religious views, and so you're genetically predispositioned towards having certain attitudes. Like we know religiosity is at least partially genetic. You may be biologically predisposed towards being a liberal or a conservative. Oh, that's just sacrilege, isn't it? Now, not all attitudes are equally strong, and this matters because strong attitudes are, number one, more resistant to change. They're more stable, so they're less likely to shift, and they're less flexible than weak attitudes. Strong attitudes resist change because of commitment to the attitude as well as how deeply embedded the attitude is. Commitment involves a certainty that the attitude is correct, whereas embedded means that the attitude is much more fully integrated into your self-concept, your values, your social identity. So how much do you identify with being a Republican or a Democrat? How much do you identify with being a Christian? Like how much is that part of who you are? And without that, you would lose something of yourself. That's embeddedness. And being committed to an attitude causes one to review relevant information in a biased way. So remember, commitment means the certainty that your attitude is correct. And so when you receive information, if you're certain that you're correct, then any information... Am I getting a back rub? Yeah. In other ways, strong attitudes tend to cause individuals to pay close attention to confirming information and to ignore or minimize the importance of any like counter-attitudinal information. So when you get information that goes according to your bias, then you're in a good mood. So when you get information that goes according to your bias, you will accept it, but if it goes against what you believe, then you ignore it or discount it or minimize it. Embedded attitudes resist change because they are integrated with so many other aspects of the person that to change one would require changing many other things about yourself. So you would lose who you are to a certain degree if you changed your attitude. Now I know I talk a lot about cults in this class, and that's because cults use like every trick of social psychology in order to convince you to leave behind your old self and to take on a new cult personality. So talking about attitudes, this chapter, Attitudes and Persuasion, is probably more relevant to cults than any other chapter in the book. So, well, why don't you keep drinking your bottle, huh? Good idea. So cults create an attitude that is strongly committed, so you strongly believe that your attitude is certain, and then they also embed the attitude deeply into you so that it becomes who you are, and you kind of lose your non-cult self. So to leave the cult, you're losing yourself. Now, several factors influence the likelihood that a person's behavior will be consistent with his or her attitude. So just because you have a certain attitude doesn't mean that you always behave consistently to it. Consistently with it, consistent, whatever the word is, consistent to it. So some of the factors are like the knowledge you have, the personal relevance the attitude has to you, attitude accessibility, and intention. So knowledge influences the attitude behavior consistency, because the more knowledge we have about something, the more likely it is that our pertinent attitudes and the actions will be consistent. In other words, the more we know about something, the more likely it is that our behavior will be consistent with our attitude towards the object of our attitude, because we just know more about it. The more you know about something, the more that attitude lines up your behavior to follow it. So you may be concerned about the environment, so you have that attitude towards it, but the more you know about how bad things are, the more likely you are to do certain things that will help the environment. Then personal relevance. Did I skip one? No. Okay, personal relevance. So we're more likely to engage in a behavior consistent with our attitudes when that attitude involves something that is personally relevant. For example, our attitudes towards pornography may become really relevant. And so, like, for instance, your spouse uses pornography and you feel like that's adultery and you're very betrayed and it really hurts the relationship. And so then, because that's so personal, that's so personally relevant, then that attitude now becomes strongly predictive of your behavior. So the more personally relevant something is, the more likely you are to behave in alignment with that attitude. And then attitude accessibility. This is attitudes that come to mind quickly and that are more accessible are more likely to predict behavior. For example, the speed with which someone can tell you who he or she plans to vote for is a good predictor of how they will actually vote. Okay. So how quickly can you call those attitudes to mind? And it's similar to personally relevant. The more personally relevant something is, usually the more attitude accessibility there is. But basically it's like, do you spend a lot of time thinking about this? Is this something that if someone brought up a conversation, you could quickly delve into it and bring out facts and information, which is the knowledge part. So you can see how this all kind of blends together. There's something called the theory of planned behavior, and this is for behavioral intentions. The theory of planned behavior suggests behavioral intentions are also important predictors of behavior. So like subjective norms, which are the degree to which people important to an individual are perceived as agreeing or not agreeing with the attitude. So subjective norms is like, does a society or even a subculture of a society believe a certain thing? That's a subjective norm. And then perceived behavioral control, which is the degree to which one believes that one is capable of engaging in the desired actions. These both influence the degree to which the behaviors will be consistent with the attitudes. Okay, so that's the theory of planned behavior. That behavioral intentions are important predictors of behavior. You plan to behave in a certain way, and because you intend to have that behavior, you are more likely to follow it through. I mean, that sounds obvious, and a lot of psychology is so obvious, but think it through and like, what would a cult do or in order to get you to to join the cult? Or what would a salesman do to get you to buy a sale? And so a lot of salesmen will say, what are your goals? what do you want to achieve? It's one of the first things they want to get out of you, because they want your brain to have a behavioral intention, and for that to be at the forefront, which would be the attitude accessibility. So they really want to get you to say, this is my intention, and then it's much harder to not act on your intention now that it is an intention. So, for instance, people who write down their goals of losing weight are more likely to lose weight. Okay, so that's the theory of planned behavior. If you plan for the behavior, you're much more likely to actually do the behavior. Okay, all right. So those are attitudes, and attitudes are in everything from, whether you're going to buy a car to your beliefs about religions or races, or anything. An attitude is simply a negative or positive belief towards a thing, an object, an event, something like that. So when we have attitudes, people are always persuading us, and we're persuading others, to change our attitudes. When Jehovah's Witness comes to your door and tries to convince you to become Jehovah's Witness, they're persuading you to change your attitude towards Jehovah's Witness and join them. So persuasion is basically a change in a private attitude or belief as a result of receiving a message. So you can see how that can apply to religions, cults, politics, sales, anything like that. So efforts to persuade can be direct and purposeful. They can be indirect. They can be accidental. People don't always mean to persuade you to change your beliefs, and you don't always mean to try to persuade others' attitudes to change. Or you can be purposefully, you could become a missionary and you go out there trying to change people's beliefs. Is he falling asleep? Yes. So social psychologists are not interested in the accidental or the indirect. They usually are studying the purposeful efforts to persuade others, like with sales or cults or politics or religion, all those things that I've said over and over again. When we use the term persuasion, it's limited to internal change. Anyone can change their public behavior in response to situations or persuasion efforts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've changed their internal attitudes. It's only when a message brings about inner change in one's views on a topic that we can say persuasion has actually occurred, which you'll see in your personal relationships. When you're trying to get another person to act differently, they may temporarily act differently, but if persuasion hasn't occurred unless their attitudes have truly changed inside, and then you'll never have to tell them a second time to change because now their attitudes have changed. Although you could, even with relationships, you could go back to the attitude behavior consistency. So somebody's attitude can change without behavior necessarily being consistent with their attitude. So you have the knowledge, personal relevance, attitude, accessibility, and behavioral intentions. So if you can incorporate those four things into like a relationship argument, you might be able to get more behavioral change out of the other person. But anyhow, so how do we measure attitude change? This can be very difficult because the goal is to measure change without causing the change, and anytime a scientist or a researcher goes into an environment, they create change. So simply by trying to measure attitude change, you might be causing attitude change. If individuals know that you're attempting to measure it, they might alter their behavior simply because they know they're being observed. And to aid in this endeavor, researchers have developed what they call non-reactive measurement techniques. And non-reactive measurement is measurement that doesn't change a subject's response while recording them. And typically this is done by observing an individual's behavior rather than asking him or her about an attitude. Rather than, like if I give you a questionnaire and I say, answer these questions about your attitudes towards homosexuality, the way I word them might cause your attitude to actually change, and is a persuasion technique in and of itself, which is not what you want in research. It might be something you want if you're an activist, but it's not something that you want if you're just trying to get objective data. Data is plural, data is singular. So one example is these researchers were able to predict the outcome of a presidential election by looking at which candidates' flyers people removed from their windshield and threw away. So presumably They were less likely to discard their preferred candidates' flyers, and that is how they ended up voting. And so this is a non-reactive measurement because they didn't ask the people to express their beliefs. They simply watched to see, did these people keep the flyer or did they throw it away? So if you love Biden, you're probably not going to throw his flyer on the ground. You're going to keep it. But again, the point is non-reactive measurement. All right, so let's talk about cognitive responses. Where are we at the PowerPoint? So let's talk about self-talk. So when considering what techniques to use to induce change, the techniques are important, but we also have to understand how that change occurs. Okay, so the cognitive response model of persuasion suggests that we can learn more about attitude change and persuasion by studying what individuals say to themselves or what they think in their brain as a result of receiving a persuasive communication. And for persuasion to be effective, then the persuasive message must initiate positive cognitive responses from the audience. Okay, so let's say that again, because I was distracted. So the cognitive response model of persuasion suggests that we can learn more about attitude change and persuasion by studying what individuals say to themselves as a result of receiving a persuasive communication. So if I try to convince you to become Mormon, what goes on in your brain? What do you think? What do you say to yourself? And you can learn more about attitude change and persuasion by studying that than any other type of technique. Okay, that's the cognitive response model. So besides considering features of the intended message, like the strength and the logic of the argument, you should take into account an entirely different set of factors that are likely to enhance positive cognitive responses to your message. So you want to induce, if you are the one trying to create the change, you want to induce positive self-talk. So you want to do something to get the person thinking positively about your message. Then we have counter-arguments. A counter-argument challenges and opposes other arguments. So the communicator, so like if you're trying to persuade someone, you should do all that you can do to reduce the effectiveness of counter-arguments. And that can, the counter-arguments can diffuse persuasion and can limit the persuasion attempts. So there's several effective techniques that can be used to reduce the likelihood of the other person generating a counter-argument. So you could use an expert. You could give them little time to produce a counter-argument. You know, sometimes it takes a while to think of a counter-argument. So if you can limit the time they have to think, then you can limit their ability to come up with counter-arguments. You can give them distracting or demanding tasks where they can't use their brain power to come up with counter-arguments. And cults will do all of this. So will salespeople. You know, they might be trying to sell you something in a busy shop where there's lots of stuff going on and lots of noise, and you just can't think to fight. I'm trying to keep his head from falling. You can't think to fight what the person is saying, and because you can't think, because there's too much pressure on you, then you may give in. So, like for instance, my family used to run a wedding venue at our ranch, and we didn't believe in trying to force somebody into having their wedding there. So once we gave our sales pitch, we would actually say, we're going to walk away for 10 minutes so you can think about it, and then we'll come back, and if you have any more questions, we'll answer it. Because I guess we could have gotten more sales if we had put more pressure on them and not given them the time and the space to come up with counter arguments. But what we found is that if we didn't allow people the opportunity to really choose for themselves and to think it through, then they would have buyer's remorse, and then we would have all sorts of trouble with unhappy brides and grooms because they signed up just because of the pressure rather than truly wanting it. So when we gave them the extra time to think, we got brides and grooms that were truly happy with having their wedding at our venue. And that prevented all sorts of problems. All right, so sometimes you don't want to use cult techniques. Cults work because they are able to put constant pressure on people, sometimes for years, sometimes decades of putting this pressure to limit people's ability to come up with counter arguments. And you may not want to do that because there's certainly an ethical dilemma, and it may be something that actually doesn't work well for you. And so these techniques are something you might want to avoid using, and we had to learn it the hard way. We had to learn that people will sign up for something that's even very expensive without giving it complete thought because of the pressure that's put on them. And so we purposefully went opposite and took the pressure away, and that ended up being better for everybody. Now you can you can use something called an inoculation procedure and counter-arguing. So a method for providing someone with resistance to an opponent's persuasion efforts is to use an inoculation procedure, which is where a weak message favoring the opponent's position is provided. Okay, and that's probably confusing, but here's an example. You see it all the time with politics, where a politician might say, yes, so and so is right when he says X, Y, and Z. However, here's my even stronger position. And because you give credit to the other person, that strengthens your position even more, because now you're being honest. And so that's what we call an inoculation procedure. Inoculation is also what we call vaccines. So you're kind of vaccinating the person against the attitude or belief by giving them a little bit of the attitude or belief. And it's not always a bad thing. The reason why it works is because when people are being honest, then it does show that they are a more trustworthy person. However, the things that we naturally use in positive ways to do good things for other people are also what the manipulators use in order to hurt people. Okay, so you have to remember that. Sometimes good and bad people are using the same exact techniques. And when the good people use it, it's good, and when the bad people use it, it's bad. There's something called the dual process model of persuasion, and this suggests that there's two basic ways that attitude change occurs: with thought and without much thought. Okay, I know that's very basic, but it's an important thing to think about. So sometimes we are persuaded to change with a lot of thinking, with a lot of effort, and it's a very cognitive process. And then there's other times we're persuaded to change without any thought. So for instance, Carl's Jr. used to, maybe they still do, I don't know. I don't watch commercials. Does anybody watch commercials anymore? But they used to, and a lot of other companies still will put like sexy women washing a car or eating a hamburger or whatever. It has nothing to do with the product. But we are being persuaded to like that hamburger because a nice-looking woman being sexual is something that appeals to people's brains unconsciously, or sometimes consciously. But without thinking about it, you might be going, "Oh, that's a disgusting commercial," but your brain's going, "Oh, but that's a nice-looking woman," and then through classical conditioning, you are more attracted to the hamburger as well. And that sounds stupid, but that is how the brain works. Okay, so sometimes you have to think to be persuaded, but many other times you are persuaded without much thought. So in a similar vein, the elaboration likelihood model of persuasive communication holds that there are two routes to attitude change: the central route and the peripheral route. So the central route to persuasion involves focusing on the quality of the arguments being used in persuasive communication, and the peripheral route to persuasion, which is taken when the message recipient either doesn't have the motivation or doesn't have the ability to focus on argument quality, and it involves focusing on some factor other than quality, such as communicator status or attractiveness. Okay, so with a hamburger commercial, you don't want to put a lot of thought into whether that's a good quality hamburger or not, and so then you end up using a peripheral route, I can't speak, which is the person is attractive, and so therefore the hamburger is attractive. And again, that sounds stupid, but it's how the human brain works. Okay? Or if you look at Hitler, Hitler gave these amazing speeches. I would say Hitler is the best speech giver in recorded history that we know of. I don't think any speech analyst would argue that that is the fact. And he sounded good. Listen to his speeches. Maybe I'll post some in the discussion board. Listen to his speeches and tell me that even though you can't understand anything that he's saying, it feels persuasive. There's something about it that pulls you in, and kind of, if you didn't know it was Hitler, you would totally be excited about whatever that person had to say.
Als unsere Partei gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Nicht die intellektuellen Schichten haben mir den Mut gegeben, dieses gigantische Werk zu beginnen. Sondern das kann ich sagen, den Mut habe ich nur gefasst, weil ich 2 Schichten kannte, den Bauer und den deutschen Arbeiter. Die kannte ich. Und wir haben nun gearbeitet. Und wir haben in diesen 9 Monaten Ungeheuerliches erreicht. Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich habe die anderen genauso vernichtet. Sie sind
Unser Führer, der Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler, hat das Wort. Wir wollen nicht liegen und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. Es kann niemand hier gegen mich aufstehen und zeigen, dass ich je gesagt habe, der Wiederaufstieg Deutschlands sei nur eine Frage von wenigen Tagen. Immer und immer wieder predige ich, der Wiederaufstieg der deutschen Nation ist die Frage der Wiedergewinnung der inneren Kraft und Gesundheit des deutschen Volkes. Wir haben nicht ihre Kolonien. Wir haben nicht alle die Möglichkeiten internationaler Weltverbindungen, die diesen Staaten und Völkern zu eigen sind. Wir müssen unser Reich, in dem wir so beengt sind und so wenig Lebensvoraussetzungen besitzen, sorgfältig überlegt bearbeiten und bewirtschaften. Wir kommen ohne Plan nicht aus. Deutschland sieht ein! Sieht ein! Sieht ein!
So you don't focus on the quality of the argument, you focus on the communicator, or the status of the communicator, or how well he communicates, or what he looks like. Okay. Oh, bless you. Okay. Ooh, that's a bad cough, huh? You don't have the motivation to process an argument, you tend to take the peripheral route. So motivation to process a message is influenced by the personal relevance of the topic to the message recipient and the person's need for cognition. Now, some people don't have a high need for cognition, and other people do have a high need for cognition, and everywhere in between on a continuum. So need for cognition is the tendency to enjoy and engage in deliberative thought. Some people like to think, some people like to be challenged, and other people don't. You know, it makes smoke come out of their ears. And that doesn't mean they're stupid, it just means that they don't have as high of a need for cognition. They don't enjoy thinking. So individuals with a high need for cognition are more motivated to engage in the the effortful task of thought about the quality of the arguments rather than the persuasive peripheral component of like the communicator status or attractiveness. Okay, so people with need for cognition are usually less likely to fall for scams because they think things through. Now that can be used against you. You can get people to overthink. You can get people to think about the wrong thing. So that does not guarantee you won't be scammed or pulled into a cult or something. But you're definitely more protected than somebody with a lower need for cognition. And again, that doesn't mean that you're dumb. And also, need for cognition can be situational. So in certain situations, you might be more motivated to think, to have more cognition. Okay, so it doesn't mean that that you're always a low thinker. It could be the situation. Some of the situations we're willing to think more about, and others not. Okay, and you can of course see how easily that can be used by cults or salespeople or politicians in order to, convince you to persuade you to change your beliefs about something. Now, the dual process model assumes that individuals are more likely to think about the quality of arguments being used in a persuasive message when the content or focus of that message is personally relevant. Okay, so if it's personally relevant, the dual process model assumes you're more likely to think deeper about it. Individuals who have a high need for cognition, however, are motivated to think about issues and messages even when they're not personally relevant. And the higher their need for cognition, the more likely they are to give deep thought to everything, even if it's not important to them. And these individuals have also been shown to expend more effort and be more swayed by the quality of arguments in a persuasive message than those low in need for cognition. Okay, so this is how it can be used against you. If you have low need for cognition, then when somebody gives you a good argument that should change your attitude, you're less likely to change your attitude because you're not going to think it through. So how could it change you? Whereas somebody who has a high need for cognition, they can be swayed more easily because they're willing to think about it. And with cults, and you'll notice in the cult book that you have to read, he'll talk about how people who get pulled into cults are usually people who are searching, who are open, who are trying to find new ideas, and they're thinking about life. So these are people who are who have a high need for cognition, at least for this situation, and probably in general, I would guess. And because of that, when a cult presents them with an argument, and they're really good at presenting it in a way where it comes across as logical and makes sense and so on, they're more likely to be pulled into it because they give it thought. So people who are not thinkers usually don't get pulled into cults, which you'd kind of think it was the opposite, but it's not. All right, so having the desire to think critically about the quality of an argument being used in a persuasive communication is not enough, though. So you may want to think, but you also have to have the ability to engage in that kind of effortful thinking. People who and it's not just low intelligence, but if you don't have enough time to think about the argument, if there's, like we talked about this before, the being distracted and, all of these distractions that can come in and prevent you from being able to think things through. Even if you want to think about it, you may not be able to because you're exhausted. And this is what cults do to people. They keep you working as much as they can to keep you exhausted, many times to keep you malnourished, so that you can't think. So they pull in people with a high need for cognition, and then they prevent them from being able to use their cognition in order to keep them there. All right, I'm going to put this guy down for a nap, and then I will be back.